but it doesn't meet the threshold of negligence. Yeah? And then the last one, what's the fourth one? Harm and that omission. And related to that, there should be nothing intervening in between. So I had a case where somebody wanted to sue the doctor. And this is a real case, a pediatric patient. Why? Because the doctor, the baby, it was a child, got hypoxic brain damage and then eventually died. Was there a duty of care? Yes, there was. Was there a breach of that duty? Yes, there was, because the child got hypoxic brain damage. What was the cause of this brain damage? It was hypoxia. Okay, so there was causation. So that fits that criteria. When you go to court, your chances of winning as a clinician are very low. So these are the elements of negligence. Now I want to illustrate a case that happened in Nairobi Hospital. Now all these cases are public documents. If you do Kenya law reports, and you Google this, you will find it there within Kenya law reports and you search for it. So this is the case. This was a child. This is the case, a child of a doctor. And that's why you're finding the first plaintiff is the complainant, and these are defendants. Defendants is straightforward. So plaintiffs are complainants. So complainant number one is the patient. Complainant number two, on behalf of complainant number one, was the father, and complainant number three was the mother. Okay? Then defendant number one is the anesthetist. Defendant number two was the ENT surgeon, and defendant number three was the hospital. And I'll explain why the hospital is always involved. And that's why it's important for the hospital to put systems in place. Because it's not just the clinician who gets sued, almost always the hospital will also get sued. So this was a straightforward phase. What's phase? Procedure, endoscopic? Yes. So what does phase stand for? What does phase stand for? F-E-S-S. Well, you'll check it out, yeah? So it's a simple endoscopic procedure. It's supposed to take maybe 30 minutes where you do tabinectomy and patient is out. Now, the difficulty, because you're working in the nose, is anesthetic difficulty. And the anesthetist has to pay extra attention to it. Now, because it's a fairly straightforward procedure and it's being done by a very experienced doctor, not in this case, but in some cases, you have anesthetists who run multiple theaters at the same time, isn't it? Yeah. So what happens when an anesthetist runs multiple theaters at the same time? What gets compromised? What gets compromised? So, but the anesthetist is there to correct it. So yes, care will get compromised, but what type of care? And sometimes, because you're running between two theaters, you go to this theater and you go to that theater, and you're adjusting things, because nowadays most things are on monitors. So if something happens, you're able to see. But what is the biggest problem? Beyond clinical care is documentation gets compromised. Keep this in mind. You have somebody who is super busy. What do we do with alarms? You mute them. So how do you know when something is going wrong? So these are some of the areas where we put ourselves at high risk. Now, many current equipment, the mute button has been disabled. You cannot mute. Many current equipment you cannot mute. Both critical care equipment and theater you cannot mute. So in this case, what happened, these are the particulars of the negligence. Where are these particulars from? Where is this information from? This information is from the court So this is from what is from the court files. Okay? Now, where do you think they got this information from? First and second defendant. Who was the first and second defendant? Sorry? Remember, plaintiff, defendants are the ones defending. First defendant is anesthetist, second defendant was the ENT surgeon. Dr. Chimi Omama Olende is an extremely experienced ENT surgeon. Okay? Praxidis Okutoi was my classmate in, I think it was even a year or two ahead. Do you know when I graduated? Undergraduate? 1992. And I did my master's in 1995 to 1998. And I'm telling you, Praxi was my classmate. So these are extremely experienced people. Understand that. It's not incompetence. These are extremely experienced people. Now, with these experienced people, now let's look at what the particulars of the negligence. You have quality of care. So number one, and I will read them. First and second defendant, late arrival for the scheduled surgery. Because you've arrived late, failure to properly and adequately prepare the same, thereby endangering the first plaintiff's life. The first plaintiff is the patient. Okay? The first defendant, the anesthetist, failure to carry out complete history and physical examination on the first plaintiff and or evaluate the same before rendering an anesthetical treatment. Explain to me in what happens in current setup. What do you think this means? Remember, it's a very straightforward procedure. This patient was a healthy young adult. What happens to the anesthetist is, let's meet in theater. You understand? So, you have not examined the patient. Or the last time you examined the patient was several weeks ago. So, and I'm not saying it's in this case, so I just want to put that disclaimer so I don't get sued for slander. But I'm just elaborating and illustrating. So, you say, let's meet in theater. You haven't examined the patient. Okay. In your system as a hospital, do you allow for that? So if a patient is in theater before the anesthetist has seen, what happens? In Jalaram today, what happens? Who works in theater here? So what happens if the patient comes to theater before the anesthetist has seen?
The anesthetist has to see the patient.
So, but the patient is already in theater?
No, there is a place where they give the patient, so we don't put inside before.
Okay. So is there a policy that says that? Okay. So I'm trying to show you why the hospital gets joined into this. Because the hospital must have a system. If the system exists and the doctor then bypasses the system, the hospital has legs to stand on. But the question you'll be asked is, what is your system in place? So, part of the system is the patient doesn't move into theater unless you have a checklist first. And what is on a checklist?
Pre-op checklist.
Pre-op checklist. That says what?
Pre-op checklist.
No, but what does it say specifically? Anesthetist, seen, tick. So we'll come to consent. I want to emphasize the issue of pre-op assessment. You see, separate issues. We are not discussing consent now. What we are discussing is the defendant arrived late, the defendant failure to carry out a complete history and physical examination. Isn't this basic? So how did you fail to carry a complete history and physical examination?
It is there, we have it in place.
So how come it appears here that you failed to carry a complete history and physical examination? What do you think happened? Number one, let's meet in theater. Number two, documentation. You might have done it, but did not document. In law, if it's not documented, it wasn't done. So that's why I started by emphasizing these extremely senior doctors. I am 100% sure they did complete history. I'm 100% sure they did complete physical examination. Where did they document it? So it wasn't documented, therefore not done. The first defendant failure to make appropriate pre-operative evaluation. Which anesthetist will take you to theater without telling you what is it called, malampati, and I don't know, anesthesia score and all these things? Which one? What is the problem again? Documentation. You understand? If you did it and you did not document it, it's not done. I'm emphasizing on that because this is one of the commonest reasons why we get sued. Number one, documentation. Number two is poor documentation. Okay? Then, the first defendant failure to observe proper and reasonable intraoperative care. Again, what happened? What is intraoperative care? BP is up, you write it down. What did you give? Fluids given, you note it down. Then what? Blood is too dark, you note it down. So what do you think happened here? You know that's the common practice. Documentation. There you go. So it is not documented? It's not done. So if it's not done, how do you prove it breach the duty of care? It's not enough to say I did it. No. Show me. And you know what happens in court? They take the entire file and make copies of it. So like now here, how many plaintiffs you have? So if it was different cases, these are related, so they'll probably have one lawyer. But if there were 3 different lawyers, each lawyer here will have their own copy of the file complete. Each lawyer here will have a copy of the file complete. So you'll have like 6 or 7 copies of the file. And they have gone through it with another doctor to guide them, or a clinical person, and tell them, this one, no, this one is wrong. It's called particularization. You actually identify what went wrong, and not only what went wrong, who was responsible. That's what your colleagues will do. They sit with the nursing and they say, is this what happened? They tease out the omissions. Okay. So I think I've made my point about documentation, so I'll move a little faster here. So the second defendant, failure to take adequate steps to ensure treatment of the plaintiff was carried out in accordance to non-medical standards. What is non-medical standards? What is non-medical standards? Article 43 of the Constitution of Kenya says, and this is under Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about the Bill of Rights. These are your rights. You have a right to the highest attainable standard of health. Not healthcare, of health. South Africa says healthcare. Kenya says of health. What is the highest attainable standard of health? In other areas, they've documented it as accessible, affordable, acceptable, and quality. AQ. Accessible, acceptable, affordable, and quality. Let's go back to quality. Standard of care. What standard? They will take another anesthetist. You are judged by your own peers. And mind you, hindsight is 2020. They are not under pressure. They have all the current best practice. And they say, in these circumstances, this is what should have been done. If you're a GP, they'll bring another GP. If you're an anesthetist, they'll bring another anesthetist. If you're an ENT, they'll bring another ENT. You're compared with your peers. If you're an anesthetist of 50 years of practice, they'll bring an anesthetist of 50 years of practice. They're comparing with peers. This is an extremely experienced team of doctors. The witnesses will be an extremely experienced team of witnesses. And now they bring with clinical guidelines, algorithms. Do you have yours? No. They will get the best. And they'll say, what should you have done? What did you do? Establishing omission. You should have taken blood pressure every half an hour. How frequently was your blood pressure taken? It was recorded once at the start of theater. You understand? So, if it's not written, it's not done. So, did you meet the standard of care? No, you did not. You are experienced, you've been doing this. Now, is it that you didn't meet it? It doesn't matter. You didn't document it, you didn't do it. Okay? Now, what's the protocol if you are likely to be sued? These are another important ways, Madam medical records. Most important issue. What is the most important issue when there is a likelihood of anything being sued? When a medical director, sequestration of the file. You remove that file out of circulation and make a copy. That file has to be under lock and key. In another hospital, they were found to have tampered with a file. And that did not go well with them because they were found to have tampered with a file. So the first thing you do so that people don't black out papers and insert papers, you sequester the file and make copies. Anybody who wants to deal with that file gets authority from the medical director and deals with a copy. Okay? Because you'll be asked to circulate that file. It's not the original file you'll circulate. The doctor will come. By the way, how long does this take place? Let me give you an idea of the court process. So you apply. You first write a demand letter. I, Majid Twahir, have been instructed by my client to demand and thereby here do so that you admit liability. And having admitted liability, we demand that. And so there is a demand letter. How long do I give you? I give you 2 weeks to respond. You don't respond, so I start the court process. By the time this goes to court, how long has it been? 1 year is when the case is starting. Can you remember anything? No. So you go back to your file. So that's why the file is sequestered. So you have to keep on reviewing the file. So you sequester the file, you review the file. So here now, second defendant, failure to carry out complete history and physical examination. What do you think happened? Second defendant is an extremely experienced ENT surgeon. What do you think happened? Documentation, number one. Number two, what are we dealing with? ENT. So what do we do? Quickly, our notes. Nose, okay, no sinus, no pain. It's not nose you're treating. What are you treating? The patient. What was the HB? What was the pulse rate? Did the patient have any other complaint? What is the family and social history? You've done none of that because it is, in your view, irrelevant. So we tend to focus in our area of specialty. I put the stethoscope, there were no heart sounds were normal, no murmurs. Because I'm a cardiologist, I focus in that area. I forget that I'm treating the patient in totality. If I'm a dermatologist, I'm only focusing on the spots that the patient came with. I'm failing to see that the patient is extremely pale. We've had a patient who went for endoscopy. Why? Because the patient had epigastric pain. And what did the patient have? Inferior wall MI. Martha, you remember this case? Yes. Inferior wall MI, patient is on that table in endoscopy, patient arrests. You go back in hindsight, classical MI. But because the patient ended up with a gastroenterologist, what was the thinking? GI. So what do? Scope. Patient arrested on the table. Why? Because we were treating the stomach, not the patient. We are together. So this is what happens when you see statements like this. Second defendant, failure to carry out a complete history. Two things: documentation and overly focusing in a very narrow area. Okay. Then second defendant, failure to take adequate steps to ensure treatment of the first plaintiff was carried out in accordance with discussed medical standard. Okay, I want to move to now the third defendant. Who was the third defendant? The hospital. Why is hospital being sued? They are not the ones who did surgery.
They have the money.
True. It's easier to get money from the hospital. But what is the legal basis? They are supposed to ensure procedures exist in that hospital, number one. Number two, they are supposed to ensure the doctors are properly qualified. Number three, they are supposed to ensure adequate supervision. Okay, failure to provide appropriate functional equipment in theater. Any problem in theater now becomes an issue. Even if it's a blinking bulb, you see, didn't we tell you? They didn't have, you see. Yeah. The third defendant, retaining and holding out professional and non-professional personnel who could not discharge their duties. You've employed people who have caused a problem. So now I want you to understand why the hospitals insist on credentials, why the hospital insists on privileging, why the hospital should have a system that you're not working outside your scope. We had a similar death, an ENT death in a patient, very young patient. This one was hypoxic brain damage. That one was an actual death. A young person who had just gotten married, had a child, a Somali guy, went for first, they went through the cribriform plate into the brain. The patient did not wake up. Not only that, they did it on the other side as well. Both sides of the nose, they went through to the brain. Yeah. So the patient died on the table. So then you go back and look at the credentials. This doctor, documented, was supposed to work doing that procedure only